On today's episode, we are going to be discussing sheet metal replacement panels, whether it be original or whether it be an aftermarket like an Auto Metal Direct quarter panel, door skin, whatever it may be. How do you know whether you're going to fix what's existing and use the original, or whether you're just going to replace all the sheet metal on the car with new? We're going to be discussing what tools that we use to do that and what are the things that we want to think about that's going to depict whether we are fixing and modifying or using those aftermarket panels. A lot of the grinding that we're going to be doing, especially if there's excessive welds or somebody who's already botched the whole quarter panel for you, a lot of times a regular electric grinder with a grinding discs and or cutoff wheel will help you guys a lot. When you're actually finding the areas that you're going to be removing, I like to use these Blair cutters, B-L-A-I-R. It's a rotor broach, so it has a spring-loaded drill bit in the end, and this is actually more of like an end mill. It's a carbide bit. They do have these in cheaper versions, but I tend to find that they wear out or they will walk. So we're going to talk about a lot of little tricks that we do to make sure that these things are staying where you need them to be and you're not going too deep, and how you basically separate the panel. We're going to do demos on all of these things. We are going to be using a spring-loaded punch, air cutoff wheels, air saw. This is all Ingersoll Rand. As you can see, I don't find any of these air saws to last. That's why we got electrical tape holding the screws in. But out of all the ones that we have used, this one seems to be the best that we've used so far. A die grinder, 90-degree die grinder, also Ingersoll Rand. We will use different size backing plates when you do these roll-locks. Even though this is a 3-inch roll-lock disc, we'll use different sizes. Maybe we're building, fabricating a radius and you want it to flex over, or maybe we need something that stays rigid and we're trying to remove the weld. The other super handy tool we have, these are made by Steck, S-T-E-C-K. These are hardened steel. They have a sharp end, and these are used that once you go through every one of the spot welds and you have separated the panels, this can be worked in, and then you tap it with a hammer to shove it between the two pieces of sheet metal and actually separate them and break that last little bit of spot weld apart. The other thing we're going to be doing is drilling with a smaller bit for a guide so this thing doesn't walk. Some of the other tools that we'll talk about is plasma cutters. This one's a Miller 625 Extreme. And we also have our oxygen and settling torches that will help blow away some of the excessive hack. But when it goes down to how do you decipher whether you can just fix the quarter panel or whether you're cutting it apart like this 69 Mustang Fastback we have behind me, you have to be evaluating each panel and for the car. One, is the car a car that's readily available like a Mustang? Because we can buy every single panel for this car and maybe they're not as good as the originals. Sometimes you have to sit there and weigh your options. Or is it a 61 Impala that we're going to show where you cannot get certain panels and you have to either remake them or metal finish them and fix them? On the 69 Mustang, we had excessive damage where the car had been hit from the back and it had been hit from the front. Not sure if it was the same accident or not from previous life, but whoever put it back together, they basically didn't spend the time squaring anything up. Panels were just pushed over one another and then stick welded. Stick welding, I do not recommend for any of this. We're going to be doing MIG welding and or TIG welding for all of these panels. A lot of what we're going to be doing is plug welding. Plug welding is where you have a hole in an upper panel or a lower panel, and you're actually butting the two up, clamping them, and then welding them, rosette welding them together. Rosette welding or plug welding, same thing. But for the Mustang, it made more sense. We had so many areas, the whole back of the car had been cut off and spliced in with a whole nother car. The quarter panels that were put on the car in the previous shop, instead of butt welding them and then welding them and making them look good, they actually just stuck them over one another, welded them excessively, and then they V'd it out, and I don't even know why they did what they did. We had excessive areas that would have spent way more time grinding away all of that excessive weld than just ditching it and starting back at what is the farthest panel forward that's not bent, tweaked, welded on. We want to go back to the factory welds where everything is still square. Again, if you're buying new panels like we're going to show with this Mustang, the scenario that we have for that is like the floor pan. The floor pan you can get for a couple $100 and you can replace everything from the back seat back. So all the inner structure and everything was good, but our wheel wells were botched, the quarter panels were botched, the tail, even though it was new, they botched it when they welded it all back together, and we're all trying to always be better on the next project than we were before, right? So we're not perfect, and we're gonna go through this car and we're gonna get rid of all of the hackery that we can, and we'll show you guys how we have made some jigs so that way you can remove these panels and then put them back in the same area that we started with. This is the 69 Camaro firewall that we've already removed this whole section of the subframe and the coil pocket for the strut tower. And these have a torque box. The torque box is keeping the frame rail. The frame rail typically goes right here, and it keeps your side motion from when you're going into turns from this frame rail flexing either side. And this car had for subframe connectors, and they just took a piece of tubing to connect the two. They hung down super low, and then they just stick welded these brackets up underneath the frame rail. And although that serves the purpose that it needs, we're trying to do everything on this car to look of a very high quality, and not only look good, but also perform good and be strong and structural. We came through and we saw a cancer hole that was in the floor from the inside, and a lot of it is because your fender well right here is throwing dirt and grime and water, and a lot of times it's not the water that gets on there right now that's the worry, because we can always take off surface rust quickly. It's all the dirt and grime that gets into these pockets and stays and keeps the moisture that begins to cancer out all the inner pieces. Well, what they had done was they had covered over, this is the frame rail, and you can see where they have stick welded just a chunk of metal over. So we really didn't know what we had underneath until we removed all this frame rail. So pretty much anywhere that didn't look factory, and you saw this, we've completely removed from this car. We were glad we did, because we have sections like this that are completely rusted out, and you would have never known that was there unless you remove the frame rail and the torque box. So where do you make the determination on your vehicle on whether you're replacing with aftermarket or you're making this from scratch? Well, that should be a determining factor on the car that you're going to build. Maybe your budget doesn't allow you to buy that 62 Tempest that they don't make anything for. I don't know. But for a 69 Mustang, they make every part for this car, and we can buy all of these pieces. We have already bought, this is a brand new torque box. We went with CJ Pony parts for this particular car, and these will fit in really nice. We have the whole sub frame rail. It comes already built with the whole suspension pocket and everything that we're going to put in this. What's nice about this is the availability of all these parts make this simple. It's not going to be simple because some of these parts don't fit like the factory ones, and that's where we're going to show you guys over a series of videos, I'm sure, on how we make modifications to this. But today is more giving you guys the information of how you determine if you're going to keep it or if you're even going to build the car. And you're going to be looking for cars that have all of those booger welded areas, or you're going to be looking for a quality weld. Obviously, if the car had damage and they did a quality job, the weld is not going to be looking like that frame rail. So paying attention to all those details. Are you looking underneath the Raptor liner or the undercoating that somebody has put underneath the car to hide things? Don't go by judging the book by the cover on the outside just because it's shiny and pretty. What does everything on the inside look like? This car, when it got hit, it actually pushed up this core support, and if you were just sighting in the car, sitting on the stand here, or the car lift that's level, you could see that the core support is not even square with the firewall. Well, when this car came here, it was a running, driving car, and all of the panels, the hood, the fender, nothing quite lined up right, and things were longer than one another. And now that we've already gotten the car stripped down to bare metal, it's starting to show its face. There were brackets welded into the whole coil pocket area of the strut, and they had actually drilled and removed some of the holes for the upper control arm. The fact that this car has all of these parts readily available, it made more sense to take all of the spot welds out and then just replace it with new, and we can make the minor adjustments. But if this is daunting to most of you guys and intimidating, because we're going to show you the rest of this car, we're only keeping part of the firewall, the floor, and the roof, and some of the inner structure in the back behind the quarter panels. I'm not saying chop your car up into a million pieces, but maybe you take it in bite-sized pieces that you can control. What if it's a quarter panel that you can buy for the car? So step one is figuring out, can you even buy the panel for that car before you either purchase it or decide to build it? And or do you have the tools and the means to fabricate that piece? Maybe it's a small section that you can just cut out and replace a cancer spot, and maybe it ends up being like this where the whole torque box is completely rotted out. What we're doing is we're taking everything all the way back to what is good, and then we're leaving, like for example, you can see here where this frame rail was, we have removed all the spot welds, and as it's thin and rusty, there's not a lot of metal there to weld to. So we've already bought the floor pan, and we're going to cut and make a butt weld in here, and we're going to remove all of this bad, all the way back to the actual floor structure where it is good. We're going to show you guys how to actually drill out each one of these spot welds, how you locate them, and some of the different tricks that you can use to take them off. A lot of times we'll just take that electric cutoff wheel and we will cut an access hole so we can see what is behind it, or are the panels sandwiched in a specific way where it matters. I think the biggest thing here is we have the ability to put the whole car together with sheet metal screws and or Clecos. Clecos are basically like a removable on the fly. It's used for the aircraft industry. We've talked about them in other videos, but we'll have to bring it out and show you. The Clecos is going to pin and hold the panel where you leave it. But what if you have a quarter panel where you need to shut a door, you can't use a Clecos? Use a sheet metal screw. Spend the time to fit everything with a sheet metal screw so that way you know things line back up. For example, we're going to take this car and we're going to media blast everything that we have that's good after we've removed all the bad. That way we can splice in our pieces, make sure everything is fitting perfectly where we need them, and then we can weld things in one at a time, understanding that when we took it apart, we took notes and or video of which panel was where. Some of them have 3-4 pieces that are sandwiched together, and we're going to put them right back exactly the way they came apart. The goal is always to make it look like you were never there. That goes down to whether you're going to find an original quarter panel or maybe it's a floor pan versus an aftermarket. The aftermarket floor pan that we bought for this car, although it is nice, it doesn't have all of the bracketry that the car had from the factory. The seat brackets, it's not in there. So you constantly need to be making sure, get your parts in hand before you cut this thing apart. We have every single part for this car already, and as we have been dissecting it, we have been ordering the onesie twosie parts that we need. Like this here, there's a strut bar that connects here with a bushing, and it's what's going to hold your control arms from side to side movement. We didn't even realize that this whole piece was completely bent under from when it got hit on this corner. This is the back of the Mustang, and as you can see, we have dissected this thing way farther than we initially anticipated. Going back to not having a frame machine and being worried about your reference points. Well, the back of this car to begin with, think about it like this. Would you rather leave all of the botched welding where somebody just butted a whole nother car up there and nothing was ever square or right? The gaps of the trunk weren't right. The gaps, quarter panel, the doors weren't right, all the way to the headlights. Every gap on this car was wonky, versus you just bite the bullet and you come through and you take everything out. So let's talk about, you got an inner wheel well, an outer wheel well, you have the quarter panel, the tail, the floor pan. There's a lot of pieces in here, and in order to do onesie, twosie, tail, and quarter, you're gonna have to spend all that time to remove all of those spot welds from one end to the other to remove that panel. Most of you guys are probably going to be starting with just a quarter panel, and that is a lot easier to start with than something to this level. But what if your car does need something to this level? Well, look at all the panels. For example, right through this section, we had the car where it was cut completely in half. So right there, I know everything from that point back is not square, it's not perfect. We have all the exterior panels to this car that once all of this gets put in, we can make minor tweaks and adjustments to get all of those things lined back up perfect. What we did to make sure that the things that are critical, like for example, seat mounts, our floor pan did not have these seat mounts. So we're taking pictures of the panels before they come out to make sure that we know how they were before we took them apart. For reference, take video. You can never make enough notes, and we knew right out of the gate that it didn't have these brackets and it had these small seat tabs that we have taken rebar and or 1-inch square tubing, and we have made a triangulated structure. We've made the structure so that way the triangulated areas don't allow the body to flex in either direction, and that way nothing is moving. So we know, even though we're going to put the floor pan in, maybe the floor pan needs minor modifications. But I want you guys to have the confidence to be able to do your quarter panel or your floor pan and not feel like it's too daunting to not tackle. Grab a MIG welder or a TIG welder, whatever you're going to choose to use, and practice just welding the same thickness gauge sheet metal that your car has. And when you feel proficient with that, you can then come through and then you're just grinding and removing. So we're going to talk about how we remove those spot welds. But more or less, if you have a structure in the vehicle that is not allowing anything to move or flex, we know that when we put that floor pan in, it has to line back up with these brackets. The outer structure has to have it aligned with the inner and outer wheel well. Where a lot of people miss the mark is they start putting these subframes back in the car, the floor pan back in the car, and they start MIG welding it back together right out of the gate. Well, think about that. If you're off even a little bit side to side up here, what is that distance when it actually gets to the tail end of the car? It could be quite a bit, and I don't recommend doing that. That's why I like to put everything together with a sheet metal screw. That way everything is close. There's a lot of alignment pins when you start taking these cars apart that you can see that there's like a 1-inch round hole, for example, on this subframe that goes all the way through the floor. We can align that stuff outside the car before it even goes up in, so we can kind of put it in with the 3 pieces, the 2 subframes and the floor pan in one, and start clamping things in and sheet metal screwing them together. Maybe you just throw a tack weld here or there and then keep track of where those tack welds are. That way, when you get the exterior panels on, if your gap is way too big or way too small, we're not committed with that floor being welded into place. We can then go, okay, the tail of the car is off to the driver's side or passenger side, and we can remove those pieces and shift it over with those exterior pieces on and make all of those adjustments to be as close as we can. The goal is that we're using aftermarket panels and we're able to achieve minimal welding on all of our gaps, trunks, door edges, that sort of thing. As soon as you start welding on all of those panels, what happens is you are changing the shape of the car. Now, I know that aftermarket panels versus OEM already have different shapes out of the gate, but again, what's the greater of the two evils? Would you rather leave the car all botched and full of filler, or have very minimal filler on a car and you have all brand new sheet metal that you're not going to worry about. For this car, now that we have all the bracing in, we're going to take this to Media Blast, get everything cleaned up. We're going to seal everything inside, outside of this car in epoxy, and we're going to mask off all the areas that we have plug welds that we're going to be connecting panels together with. And that way, when we put it back together, all this stuff that has surface rust is actually getting sealed up, where before you would have no way of actually accessing these areas to seal them up. We acid dip a lot of the cars that we have, and a lot of people ask, well, how do you get in there and seal up all of the inner structure? Check it out. This is the inner structure behind the quarter panel. A lot of the debate is, if we acid dip a car, how are we sealing this stuff back up? A lot of these panels are not sealed up even before you've acid dipped them. So no matter what, you have all of this surface rust that are lurking in those areas, even where the pinch welds come together, where panels are connected to one another. So I'm not saying to dissect your car to where every single butt weld or overlap lap joint needs to have primer in it. That's not what I'm referring to. All I'm saying is, if you have to remove a quarter panel while you're in that area, clean it up with a strip disc or have it media blasted and get rid of the rust that's there. Seal it up. Maybe it's Pour 15, maybe it's epoxy, and you want to go all the way through painting all that stuff. Just depends on what level restoration you're doing. There's a million ways that you guys can slice this. This is just to give you guys some tips and tricks, maybe that you get onesie twosie things out of this video that you weren't thinking about before you dissected your project. Take what you guys need and throw out the rest, or skip ahead, or go back to the tool section, whatever it is you need. But know that these panels aftermarket are not going to fit perfect right out of the gate, and always think 10 steps ahead about your project on fitment. You don't want to jump to a conclusion and realize that you've already shot yourself in the foot. The best way to do that, put the whole car together, and I mean the whole car. Before I put one plug weld in this floor, I'm going to use sheet metal screws, and I'm going to put the frame rails, the floor, the trunk, the quarters, the tail, the doors. We bought all brand new. Every one of those panels were so rusted out and or body damaged or botched that we just opted to buy everything new. The only thing we're not buying for this car is the floor pan, the A and B pillar. Actually, we bought B pillars, the roof, and the part of the firewall. Everything else we're completely putting new on. What's cool about this is, if you get all those panels bolted on, you now have a guide that can show you, hey, this panel needs to shift one way or the other. Regardless, at the end of the day, even if it's on the lift and not even on the wheels yet, you can still make minor adjustments with sheet metal screws before you even get to welding anything up. Don't jump to welding it all in and thinking you're done, because by the time you get done, you'll realize that you've got to cut a wheel well apart, or that needed to shift a 1/4 inch one way or the other. A lot of guys will jump to doing that, and then they are shoving the quarter panel in to fit the inner lip of the wheel well. But by doing that, you just caused a 1/4 inch of body filler across that brand new quarter panel that it needs to go together relaxed and not forced. Most of the time, like inner structures and stuff, not quite as important. But when it comes to exterior sheet metal, you need all that stuff to line up relaxed. Maybe you make minor cuts, and I think that's for a different video, where we can adjust gaps minimally. So this will be, I'm sure, several different segments to this particular car, but these are the things that you want to be thinking about to make sure you have the alignment. And again, if this car was hit and you know that it's not square back there, there's no point in making a jig for something that's not square. For example, the front. The core support to the firewall is twisted. Well, we just cut the whole front shock tower out because I already know it's not square. At least when we put the new one in, I can get it close with lasers and eyeball the laser to certain reference points that are square within the body of the car, and that way at least we're close. When we put all the fenders and hood together, we'll then see what panel needs to move where. We're making all these videos to just get onesie twosie tips and tricks, and a lot of guys get a lot of information out of our comments. So if you guys have experience, or maybe it was minimal experience, drop a comment in here about what it is that you struggled with your project, or something that you can add to this video to help someone on their project. The more you guys give me feedback, the more I can give you content on what it is that you guys want to see. We've talked about the Mustang and how all the parts are readily available. But what happens when we're doing a project like the 61 Impala flat top and the only section that you can get is from here to the door, which, as you can see, is what needs to be replaced. The problem is it's a very cheap quarter panel replacement. Although it's the section that we need, all of these shapes, this body line and this body line, are so different. These are way more crisp and sharp, and the one that we have is super rounded out, and even the edge of the detail where it goes into the B-pillar is a completely different shape. This would be a scenario where you need to find the spot welds and there's no back access. So you've got two options. You can either remove the inner panel where the window regulators are going to be and try and work all of this out with a hammer and dolly. Our goal for this car is to go through and remove all of the ripped areas, MIG welds, and damage. This had got sideswiped somewhere back in the day, and there's a lot of tears, thin metal, MIG welds. We're going to get rid of all that stuff. And yes, I might make patches from scratch and piece them in, but we're actually going to show you guys in future videos how we remove all of this damage. But I just want you guys to understand, this is what you're dissecting. This is what I want you to take into consideration and find out, can you even get the parts from the beginning? And what is that going to entail? Are you capable? Do you have the tools? And really, to remove a quarter panel, it doesn't take that many tools. So we're going to show you guys how you locate those spot welds and drill them out. When it comes to putting the panel on, when I was talking about you go through and you found all the spot welds and you've removed them all, now you have to come back through and put the quarter panel back on. Well, your jig, like we made in the Mustang, is really the B-pillar in the car. So what's already existing is going to be your jig. The inner fender well it's going to align right back where you started. It's when you get the aftermarket parts and you put them on and you realize they don't fit perfect, that's where you got to take it collectively and go, it fits in 3 different areas, and maybe I only have to chop one corner and move those areas to get it to fit good enough for you. But if you come in and you're putting a quarter panel on and you're shoving this area, you're going to end up creating a big low. Yeah, you're only pushing in that one spot with your hand to push that quarter in to get it to align, but it's going to cause so much more filler and body work, and the whole purpose of doing a new quarter is to keep that to a minimum. That's kind of what we want to be talking about, is how do you minimize the amount of work that you have, and does it make more sense to fix what you have or just buy a whole new quarter? In the Mustang scenario, we bought all new parts. We're going to make all those fit, and it's going to be far greater than spending all that time trying to grind all of those stick welds down only to get to a point where you probably have a very weak point and you got thin sheet metal already that's only 40 to 60 thousandths of an inch, and now you're going to grind it a couple times, it's even thinner. So it just becomes a battle. It's easier to just take it apart, go back to what's good, and replace what you are capable of doing. So we're going to grab a Blair tool. We're going to go in here and show you guys some of the tricks that we use to locate those spot welds from the factory. Sometimes you can't locate them when they've been MIG welded by somebody else and ground, but we'll show you guys how that works. As we evaluate this quarter panel, you can see how blown out this whole B-pillar is. So we're going to use this top section here to see if we can't locate some of the spot welds. I don't know that we're going to be able to, so we might have to move to a different spot. I'm using just a little piece of sandpaper. You could use 150 grit, 220, 80, doesn't really matter. If you used a die grinder with, say, 80 grit or 36 grit roll-lock, you're going to erase the road map of every one of those spot welds. The goal here is just to scuff this to locate where the actual spot weld is. If your car has excessive paint, then grab yourself a little butane torch, heat this area up until the paint starts to bubble, and then use a wire brush to come in and get all the paint off. Then your spot weld should be easily seen. But what you're looking for is very minute circles. That's going to be your factory spot welded areas. We're going to be using the spring-loaded punch, and a lot of guys will jump right to the Blair tool because it has a drill bit on it, and although that might work great when it's brand new, as this thing wears out, it's going to want to drill and then walk when it grabs, and it's very frustrating. So to eliminate the walking of it, I always come through and I locate directly in the center of where the spot weld's going to be, and I center punch them. I'll then take an 1/8 inch or smaller drill bit, and I will just start just putting that little divot is all you need. Now the actual rotor broach or the Blair tool is not going to walk on you near as bad. If it does start to walk, a lot of times these tips will get hot, and as soon as they're dark and burned up, they just don't want to cut. You can buy these in 3-pack or more, I think. I can't remember, but you can get these also in different sizes. This one's 3/8, and you can get them 3/4 of an inch, all different sizes. As you start to drill these, and the speed does matter, you don't want to burn them up, these carbide tips for just mild steel like we're doing should be around 1,000 RPMs, which if this drills about 1,800 RPMs on the second setting, one is half of that, and then you're at least close to the RPM range that you need to be, so that way you're not burning up tips excessively fast, and it's actually going to cut better. You'll see a substantial difference when this is brand new versus as they get worn out. Just grab yourself a new tip. It's not worth your time and frustration. As you're drilling this out, I highly recommend always using one hand obviously on the drill, and a lot of times I'll put my chest into the drill. Obviously you don't want to be where you're close enough that the drill can catch and smack you in the face, but I like to have stabilization with 2 arms, one on my panel so I can help stabilize this. As I start to drill it and it grabs the edge of the sheet metal, it will then want to grab and walk, and that's why that's important. Well, then you can take the drill and pivot it to one way or the other. Obviously here I had to pivot it upward so that way it stayed away from the very edge of the sheet metal so it doesn't grab. And then you want to drill in far enough that you see the rust come out. A lot of the dust comes out between the 2 panels where they're butted up, and as soon as you see that rust, you're through the top panel and not through the bottom. You do not want to drill all the way through both pieces. You just want to separate, and you're isolating the actual spot weld in the center stays, and you're removing the metal around it. For this panel being something that we're going to fix and then put back in the car, we need to make sure we're not completely ruining the panel versus the Mustang where everything had to go. We took a plasma cutter and cut majority of it out, and then at the very end we just left the section of floor where the 2 meet, and that way you're just going through with that steck tool and you're working it off versus having to sit here and try to work around all this excessive panel. We knew we could just remove that. This is going to take a lot more time to do than something where you're just replacing the entire panel, because then we're not having to try and save all this sheet metal. Another quick little trick is a lot of guys will not want to spend the money on the Blair tool, and that's fine. Just know that if you're a panel that you're trying to save, a lot of times you're going to ruin it if you're just trying to use a drill bit. So if you take a drill bit in, you can drill those, but you need to be using the drill very carefully to where you're not going through. The reason that this is more problematic than helpful is that the drill bit itself is pointed, and it is going to go into your base metal farther than you're going to want. So when you actually go to put the new panel over it, now you have a thin spot right where you're going to be MIG welding the new rosette weld. That's why the Blair cutter is better than a drill, is because the Blair tool is actually leaving the weld on it. That way when you get on it, you can come in with a die grinder, and like this is a strip disc, I can remove all the rust from the area, and then I can put an 80 grit disc on here, and I can remove the actual spot weld that is left higher than the base material. That way when we put our new panel on, so like the whole back of this roof is completely cancered out, I have a donor roof that I've been dissecting. I have to be very careful with every single part on this particular car because you can't get any of these panels reproduction. And then there are sections that we will have to make from scratch and splice in. It's just thinking about all of those things that you might encounter, or try to be proactive with your build so that way you don't start just welding things up and then realize, oh, you know what? The window does not fit. I purposely left all of the inner structure so that way when I put the exterior piece on, that window opening is not changing at all. Once the exterior is tack welded in and nothing is going to move, now that is my guide that I can then come in and remove the interior piece. So maybe it's a Mustang where you have inner structure and you're splicing things. Maybe you find cancer in just one area and you don't need to buy the whole patch panel. You can just bend it over your knee or make that little piece and then splice it in. But as long as things aren't moving drastically and you have a jig to hold things, always be thinking about the fitment of what is crucial and what is not. I don't want you guys to overthink this to where you don't work on your project. I want you to start with small bites and try to tackle one little thing. That one thing is a stepping stone to do the next piece. Maybe you're just doing a small patch panel versus doing a whole quarter panel. Don't let it overtake you where you're not working on your car. We're trying to give you guys the motivation and the know-how of what are those steps to get you from point A to point B. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you got something, even if it's one little tip. Share it with your buddies, help grow the channel. Leave me a comment if there's something that you would like us to elaborate more on, and we'll be happy to do it in the future. You guys have a good one. We'll see you on the next one.